enough of this. This is horrific. This is awful. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk risks an uncorking of political chaos.
You just see his neck just like open up, and there's just like so much blood that just came out. It was horrible. And all I felt was like everybody bringing me down to the ground.
When the shots rang out at Utah Valley University, the campus should have been drowning in confusion. That is the natural state after violence. Details scattered, people contradicting each other, timelines unstable, investigators working through the fog. And yet, within hours, the fog seemed to lift. An official explanation arrived, polished and whole, almost like it had been waiting to be delivered. A rooftop position, a single rifle, a towel with DNA, a half-burned note, and above it all, a name: Tyler Robinson. It was a narrative that clicked into place with suspicious ease. Investigators pointed to the DNA on the towel as though it were a lock, and Robinson was the only possible key. They spoke of the note as though it were a confession carved into stone, not a fragile fragment of burned paper. The rifle on the rooftop became more than an object. It became a stage prop for the story prosecutors wanted to tell. By the end of the day, the suspect's photo was everywhere, on news channels, on phones, in headlines, offered to the public as the face of certainty. But reality rarely works in straight lines. Real cases are jagged. They take time to piece together. Eyewitnesses disagree not because they are lying, but because chaos fractures memory. Evidence must be tested, retested, and contextualized. In most shootings, weeks pass before a coherent picture even begins to emerge. Yet here, the picture was ready almost instantly. No missing puzzle pieces, no uncertainty left for the community to wrestle with. That speed alone is a red flag. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. Why would a story move so quickly? For the public, the benefit is obvious. Fear is easier to swallow when you're told the danger has been contained. A lone gunman on a rooftop feels frightening but manageable. He's been caught, the threat is over, you can go back to class, back to work, back to life. For prosecutors, a story this narrow is convenient. One suspect, one weapon, one motive, easy to argue in court, hard for defense attorneys to scatter. And for the institutions responsible for security, the lone wolf explanation is protective. If everything can be blamed on one unpredictable individual, then no one has to ask whether the system itself failed to keep people safe. None of this means Robinson is innocent. It means the process that crowned him guilty moved faster than the evidence could breathe. DNA on a towel is not a timestamp. It does not tell us when contact occurred, under what circumstances, or who else might have touched it. The chain of custody, who collected the towel, how it was packaged, whether contamination could have occurred, is as important as the DNA itself. A burned note is not intent. Authorship must be proven, context established, and interpretation guarded against wishful reading. Yet those caveats were buried, replaced by the clean headline: Shooter identified. Speed feels merciful in the short term. It gives people the illusion of closure, but speed comes with a cost. Once a neat story is set in stone, new evidence has to fight its way in. Contradictions are dismissed as noise. Witnesses who don't fit the script are labeled unreliable. Families who ask for deeper answers are told to accept what has already been decided. The very neatness of the story becomes a barrier to the truth. And there is another cost, a quieter one: the weight placed on the family. They are asked to carry their grief inside the frame officials have given them. If the frame later shifts, if new details emerge, if inconsistencies can no longer be ignored, they are forced to grieve again, this time for the certainty they were encouraged to trust. Quick closure may soothe the public, but for those who lost the most, it can deepen the wound when the story unravels. The official narrative was too smooth, too complete, too rehearsed. Life is not like that. Violence leaves jagged edges. Investigations take time. Truth resists being wrapped up before the dust settles, and so the question lingers. Did the story move so fast because it was airtight, or because it was convenient? Was Robinson the whole answer, or just the easiest one to give? If the official account is true, it will withstand scrutiny. But if it is incomplete, only scrutiny will reveal what's missing. That is why we cannot mistake speed for accuracy or neatness for truth. Because in the end, what Charlie Kirk deserves is not the comfort of a story, it is the weight of the truth, however messy, however slow, however hard it is to face. Long before the footage surfaced, there were already whispers that the official story didn't quite fit. Students who were there that night spoke about sounds that didn't line up, gunfire that seemed to come from more than one direction. Families in the community noticed the timeline didn't hold steady. What investigators insisted was a clean sequence of events looked on the ground, far more unstable. These weren't wild theories or conspiracies. They were simple observations, the kind of ordinary human impressions that usually form the backbone of an investigation. And yet, in this case, they were buried almost as soon as they were spoken. Eyewitness memory is messy, yes, but messy doesn't mean meaningless. In fact, the contradictions that emerge from multiple perspectives are often how investigators triangulate the truth. When one person hears a shot from the north and another swears it came from the west, you don't dismiss both. You look for the geometry that makes both accounts possible, but instead of being treated as signals to explore, these voices were labeled noise. Students were told they were panicked, families were told they were confused, and doubt, which should have been a tool, was treated as a threat. The timeline was another fracture point. Officials laid out a sequence that felt tight, almost choreographed. Robinson was said to have taken position, fired, left behind the weapon, and been identified through physical evidence in a way that made the whole arc seem inevitable. But when individual accounts were compared, the neat choreography dissolved. Some swore they heard shots earlier than reported. Others remembered activity in areas the official timeline left blank. Minutes stretched and contracted, refusing to settle into the clean order prosecutors presented. Timelines in criminal cases are not minor details. They are the scaffolding of truth. To know who could have done what, investigators have to know when each event occurred. The last confirmed sighting of a victim, the first sound of a gunshot, the gap between those moments, these aren't just points on a clock. They define the difference between opportunity and impossibility. When that scaffolding wobbles, the whole structure of the case shakes, and yet, here again, the wobble was ignored. Why? Because uncertainty is inconvenient. It forces institutions to admit they don't yet have control of the narrative. It forces prosecutors to delay the tidy story that makes their case strong, and it forces the public to live with ambiguity, which feels unbearable after violence. So instead of allowing the contradictions to breathe, they were suffocated. Instead of asking what the scattered impressions might reveal, officials chose to declare the matter settled. But contradictions don't disappear when you bury them. They linger like static in the background, and over time they grow louder. Students began to share with one another what they had heard, realizing their accounts were not isolated. Families whispered about gaps they couldn't reconcile. A quiet unease spread, one that no press conference could erase. People weren't demanding a conspiracy, they were asking a simple question: why doesn't this add up? And that question is powerful, because when small cracks appear in a story, they rarely stay small. Each inconsistency may look insignificant in isolation, a misplaced minute, an odd angle of sound, but together they form a mosaic of doubt. The rooftop narrative asked people to believe in perfect alignment: one shooter, one gun, one sequence. But human experience at the scene refused to align. That refusal matters. In every major case, the truth is tested not by how clean it looks on paper, but by how well it absorbs contradiction. A story that bends to accommodate witness variation, timeline shifts, and sensory noise is usually resilient. A story that collapses at the first clash of details is brittle. The official account of Charlie Kirk's death was brittle, and the brittleness showed early, long before the camera footage, long before the audio spikes. It showed in the words of those who were there, ordinary people whose impressions were inconvenient. The tragedy is that their voices were not treated as evidence but as obstacles. Instead of being woven into the search for truth, They were set aside to preserve the illusion of certainty, and by doing so, investigators didn't just ignore contradictions. They buried the very map that could have led them closer to the truth. For weeks, the official narrative carried itself like a finished script. But then a camera spoke. Not in words, but in a flash. A sudden burst of light captured in the same hour Charlie Kirk was struck down. It was the kind of detail that should have shattered the neatness of the lone shooter story, because this flash suggested a possibility no one wanted to face. Another gunshot, another angle, maybe even another gunman. The footage was not ancient evidence dragged out years later. It was a newly installed camera, recovered and reviewed within days of the attack, which means from the beginning, authorities had access to a record that didn't quite match the story they were pushing. Yet rather than confront the implications, the response was silence. The video sat in the shadows while a grieving family tried to stitch together a picture of what had happened. Each day that passed before the footage was acknowledged was another day in which justice was delayed, another day in which the official story continued unchallenged. Look closely at what the footage showed. First, the unmistakable flare of a muzzle in the darkness. Then, as the flash faded, something else. An outline, a shadow slipping away at the edge of the frame. Not a face, not an identity, but movement, presence. The suggestion of someone else in the space. It was faint, ambiguous, but no less haunting. In a story where the official line insisted there was only one actor, the image hinted at a second. Imagery has a power that words cannot dilute. A press conference can insist there was only one gunman. A report can explain away doubts. But when people watch a video frame by frame and see what looks like another figure moving in the darkness, the seed of doubt becomes impossible to uproot. And that seed doesn't grow in isolation. It matches the whispers from the night itself. Students who swore the sound came from multiple directions, witnesses dismissed as confused or unreliable. Suddenly their voices no longer sound like static. They sound like warnings ignored. Forensic specialists who analyzed the surrounding audio added another layer. Multiple spikes were detected in the very hour Kirk was shot. Not echoes, not distortions, but distinct signatures. Separate gunfire, overlapping in time. Science in this case didn't clean up the mess, it confirmed it. Where the official story demanded a single trigger pull, the data pointed to more. And the question that follows is unavoidable. If multiple shots rang out, why was the public told otherwise? There are explanations that don't require conspiracy. A misfire, a warning shot, an unrelated discharge. Each could be argued, but each demands investigation. Each demands time, care, and transparency. What happened instead was a stall. The footage, the audio, the faint figure, they were handled slowly, explained away, or left to gather dust. And in that delay, the gap between what was known privately and what was said publicly widened into a canyon. That canyon has a cost. Imagine being a juror asked to render a verdict without knowing this evidence existed. Imagine being an investigator who walked past a clip that could have changed the entire frame of the case. Imagine being the widow or the children living each day under the weight of an official story while knowing that in some file a camera had recorded something different. The silence around the footage wasn't neutral, it was a choice to protect the narrative rather than test it. And here lies the most haunting possibility. What if the figure caught in that dim outline was not an illusion but a person? What if another shooter was always there, moving unseen, hiding in plain sight while officials rushed to close the case on someone else? If that is true, then Robinson's arrest wasn't resolution, it was only half the story, a half-truth dressed up as justice. The camera didn't just capture a flash, it captured the weight of our reluctance to see what doesn't fit. It forced us to confront that what is convenient isn't always complete, and it reminded us that silence isn't passive. It protects someone, it shields negligence, it buries the truth until the truth can no longer breathe. Silence, on its surface, feels passive. It looks like nothing more than the absence of speech, the pause between events. But in the case of Charlie Kirk, silence was not absence. It was action. It was a choice exercised again and again by people and institutions who decided that uncertainty could wait, that grief could be managed, that the neatness of a story mattered more than the untidiness of truth. And that choice carried a cost that cannot be measured only in court filings or press releases. It carried a cost in trust, in justice, in human dignity. Think of the camera footage. It was recovered within days. Its lens captured the flare of a gunshot, maybe even the shadow of a second figure. The audio analysis confirmed multiple spikes that could not easily be explained away. This evidence existed. It was not hidden in some dusty archive for decades. It was available, but it was treated as if urgency was optional. Days passed before its implications were even acknowledged, while the official story marched forward unchanged. That delay was not neutral. Every day that officials remained silent, the narrative of a lone shooter hardened in the public mind. Silence bought time for a tidy story to cement itself, and in that cement doubt was buried. The university bore its share of silence. Security teams overlooked angles that mattered. Administrators failed to review every second of available footage immediately. Whether through caution, bureaucracy, or fear of liability, the result was the same. Critical moments slipped through the cracks. An institution meant to protect its students chose stillness when action was demanded. And in that stillness, the truth was allowed to drift further away. Law enforcement carried silence too. Investigators who should have been compelled by contradiction instead dismissed it. Witnesses who insisted they heard shots from more than one direction were written off as panicked, unreliable. Families who noticed the timeline didn't line up were told to stop second-guessing. Silence became a wall, one built not of ignorance but of convenience. It kept the official story intact, but at the price of sidelining the very people closest to the truth. Even the community participated. Students who doubted their own memories chose not to press harder. Neighbors who whispered about inconsistencies lowered their voices rather than demand answers. Ordinary people, each making small, understandable choices to let their unease stay private, together formed a blanket that muffled the questions that could have kept pressure on officials. Silence is contagious. It spreads, not because people don't care, but because they fear what will happen if they break it. And so silence became the quiet co-author of the story. It didn't just follow the events, it shaped them. It allowed institutions to delay accountability. It gave prosecutors cover to pursue the path of least resistance. It told the public that their comfort was more important than their clarity. Most cruelly, it told a grieving family that their pain could wait while process ran its course. The cost of that silence is visible everywhere. It lingers on the campus that let its own students fall into confusion. It hangs over the investigators who rushed to close a case while leaving threads unexplored. It shadows the prosecutors who built their arguments on half a picture. And it lives in the home of Charlie Kirk's widow and children who wake each day not only to absence but to uncertainty. Their grief is not only for a man they lost, but for the answers that were withheld. Silence is often defended as prudence. Officials say they cannot comment while investigations are ongoing. Institutions claim they need to follow procedures. Communities remind themselves that grief takes time. But prudence that lasts too long turns into paralysis. Procedure without urgency becomes neglect. And grief without answers deepens instead of heals. Silence in moments like this is not protection, it is abandonment. And abandonment leaves scars. It erodes trust in the institutions that we're supposed to protect. It fosters suspicion that truth is being managed rather than pursued. It feeds the dangerous idea that justice is less about uncovering facts and more about preserving appearances. Those scars do not fade quickly. They will live in the students who were there that night, in the families who raised their questions, in every juror or community member who later learns that critical evidence existed but was left unspoken. The cruelest reality is that silence didn't only follow the gunman's act, it multiplied it. The bullet took Charlie's life. The silence buried the questions that might have explained why. Together, they formed a tragedy that was not only about violence, but about the human tendency to choose ease over courage. By the time the footage was revealed and the whispers about multiple shots could no longer be ignored, one truth had already hardened. The official story had been written too soon. And when a story is written too soon, what the public ends up living with is not truth, it is a half-truth. Half-truths are seductive because they feel stable. They give people something to hold on to when everything else feels broken. But half-truths don't heal wounds, they deepen them, because they carry just enough certainty to discourage questions, and just enough incompleteness to leave doubts alive forever. For prosecutors, the half-truth was convenient. It offered a clear villain and a clean arc. For institutions, it was protective. It allowed them to say the tragedy was contained to a single rooftop, a single act, a single failure, rather than confronting broader questions about oversight and response. For the public, it was comforting. Believing in one shooter, one motive, one night that ended quickly meant they could sleep a little easier. But what was given to everyone else as comfort was given to Charlie Kirk's family as confinement. They were left to live inside a narrative that may not tell the full story of why he died. Closure and truth often travel in opposite directions. Closure demands speed. It asks for a bow to be tied before the wound has even stopped bleeding. Truth resists that. It requires patience, discipline, the willingness to stay inside the mess until every contradiction has been tested. Communities, especially in the wake of violence, naturally hunger for closure. They want to believe the threat is over, that order has been restored, but when closure arrives too quickly, it trades short-term relief for long-term corrosion. The trust that binds people to institutions frays when they realize what they were given was not the whole picture. And that is where responsibility shifts, because justice does not move on its own. It moves only when people demand it. Investigators may close files, prosecutors may push a single narrative. Institutions may prefer silence, but communities, if they choose comfort over clarity, become complicit in burying the truth alongside the victim. Silence is not neutral. It chooses sides, it shields negligence, it comforts the careless, and it abandons the innocent. If we do not confront that, then Charlie's story remains unfinished, not because the evidence was absent, but because we refuse to carry its weight. Imagine his children growing up with the official story as their inheritance. A neat arc that may not be real. Imagine the widow living each day with questions that could have been answered but weren't, because someone decided speed was easier than honesty. Imagine jurors years later discovering that evidence existed that they were never shown. Half-truths do not just distort the past, they stain the future. They become the lens through which grief is processed, trust is measured, and justice is remembered. So what now? The footage exists. The contradictions exist. The silence that delayed them has already done its damage. The only question left is whether we, as a community, will accept the convenience of the half-truth or demand the fullness of what really happened. That choice does not belong only to courts or prosecutors, it belongs to us, because when the camera shows us what people refuse to see, it is not just evidence, it is a mirror. It reflects our own willingness to settle for easy answers, our own complicity in the cycle of silence. Justice for Charlie Kirk cannot mean a story that is neat but incomplete. It must mean pursuing every thread, even when it is messy. It must mean accepting discomfort, even when comfort is tempting. And it must mean recognizing that truth is not given, it is demanded. If we do not ask the questions others avoided, if we do not speak where silence prevailed, then the tragedy will not only be that Charlie was killed, it will be that we chose to leave his story half told. So the call is simple but not easy. Refuse silence, resist convenience, demand clarity. Justice does not move on its own. It moves when people carry its weight, when communities decide that half-truths are not enough, when the cost of silence is finally acknowledged and rejected. Charlie Kirk's family deserves more than closure. They deserve the truth. And the truth will not come unless we choose it. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.